Whatever you do.
I know what you're thinking.
Tonight, after the news.
I'm old and slow.
Don't call the cops.
Next, broadcast in Nikam Digital Stereo, Dennis Waterman and Jan Francis. Stay lucky.
Allied double discounts are extended by 1 week. Cord carpet is only $1.99 a square yard. These superb velvet curtains are just $9.99.
And so I inherited the family seat. I inherited the tradition of ordering the Ferrero Rocher of an afternoon. And I inherited faithful old Simmons with his lamentable sense of direction.
I am not acting on my own, but my patience has run out. General, can we expect to see tanks on the streets of the big Croatian cities?
Naši ljudi moraju biti oslobođeni.
Our people must be freed.
A postoji jedan koji je najjednostavniji.
There are many ways, but there is one which is quite simple.
Poštivati ono što smo potpisali u Igalu.
That's what we signed at Igala, be abided by, and that's it.
Yes, and the other way is very bloody.
A drugi način je vrlo krvav.
And those newly arrived tanks waiting at Sheed Station is proof enough that General Kadevic will use that option if necessary. Michael Nicholson, News at 10, Serbia.
Zagreb television revealed to the Croatian people tonight that enemy tanks were rolling through their country. At the same time, their president, Franjo Tuđman, visited frontline troops whose task it is to hold the main highway linking Zagreb and Belgrade. Dressed in battle fatigues himself, he told them the war had started and they must defend their land.
We shall fight and defend Croatia. And I hope that Europe would wake up.
His Defense Department, meantime, was dismissing reports that the armored convoys had entered Croatia to liberate Federal Army troops. They were here, said a spokesman, to take the Republic step by step. In Osijek, those claims will be put to the test. Earlier today, the town's oil refinery and power plant was bombed. Tonight, it's reported that the tanks are just 4 miles away. To add to the confusion, Federal President Stipe Mesić, a Croatian, has called on the federal soldiers to desert. Speaking in Zagreb, he warned the generals were out of control and were waging a dirty war. Earlier, the capital had its taste of war as 3 separate air raid alarms were sounded. Shoppers herded together and ran to find shelter. One special place was already reserved for dozens of babies who were hastily transferred from wards at a city maternity hospital to underground rooms where they were packed side by side. Nearby, their anxious mothers gathered, waiting to be reunited when, eventually, the all-clear came. The Croatians claim tonight that 48 enemy planes set off on bombing raids today, but as yet this city remains unscathed. Meanwhile, there are reports that a fresh column of tanks and armoured personnel carriers set off from Montenegro and is travelling through Bosnia towards Croatia's southern borders. Terry Lloyd, News at 10, Zagreb.
The Prime Minister today counterattacked over the Archbishop of Canterbury's claims that last week's rioting in Newcastle upon Tyne was linked to social deprivation. Mr Major said the rioters weren't all from deprived backgrounds. He described their behaviour as absolutely intolerable. Today, the Archbishop said he believes spiritual malaise was the cause. The vicar of one of the areas hit by the Tyneside riots, the Reverend George Curry, said the rioting couldn't be justified. It was an outbreak of wickedness.
John Major was in Cardiff today, apparently rebutting the Archbishop of Canterbury by saying the Newcastle rioters were not all victims of social deprivation.
Many of the people who took part in those riots were of different backgrounds. They weren't all from deprived backgrounds. Many of those riots, those incidents, were carefully pre-planned, and the police are fairly clear that that is the case, and that behaviour is absolutely intolerable.
The Archbishop's first clash with the government since his enthronement last April arose from his speech last night. Referring to the Tyneside rioters, he said, human wrongdoing is inextricably linked to social deprivation, poverty, poor housing and illiteracy. In a radio interview today, Dr. Carey defended those remarks.
We cannot simply label things spiritual and sinful, but we've got to see it as a whole matrix of illiteracy, of delinquency, and other aspects of human wrongdoing.
The controversy shifted attention from attempts by members of the cabinet to keep the political heat on Labour. Instead, they were asked about the Archbishop.
I know him very well. He's a good and holy man. I don't happen to agree with him on what he said last night. Neither, I suspect, will many members of the Church of England.
But Anglican bishops rallied to Dr. Carey's defence.
People who are agitators can only create agitation where there is a pool of disenfranchised, alienated youngsters who will be drawn along with them.
The controversy revived memories of Mrs. Thatcher's disagreements with Dr. Carey's predecessor, Lord Runcie. But Mr. Major is anxious to prevent that kind of frosty relationship developing. And Dr. Carey himself says he wants cooperation rather than confrontation between church and state.
The parish of Elsick, one of the toughest in inner-city Newcastle, was the centre of last week's riots on Tyneside. The parish priest, George Curry, has spent 10 years here among the housing estates and tower blocks, but he takes a radically different view from his superiors in the Church of England. The criminality and violence he sees on his doorstep are not, he says, failures of society, but failures of the Church to teach right from wrong.
I think there was an outbreak of wickedness, that's what I call it, and I think no other word will do. We saw people who were just out to get the police. It was wanton vandalism, hooliganism. People wanted fun. That's why they were committing arson. That's why they were stealing cars. That's why they were racing up and down the streets doing their handbrake turns. That's why people were burning those cars out afterwards. I think the major problem is a moral one, and we must get down to that and tackle that. And that, after all, is the job of the Church.
And not just the job of the Church, but also of parents who he believes failed to control children as young as 11 and 12 during the riots.
Our responsibility as parents is to train our children to live constructive, decent lives, not to egg them on to violence and the like. We're dealing with a massive moral problem.
That's not the view of senior churchmen in Newcastle.
I think that the situation is an extremely complex one, and here I'd want to take issue with George Curry and those who say that it is simply to do with human wickedness. I think there are as many reasons almost as you would find people in any one particular kind of gang who was doing the violence.
Undeterred, George Curry will continue preaching his message of personal responsibility in the tower blocks of Elsick, an estate where he's trebled his congregation in the last 10 years.
Hello, Susan. I've come to see you about the baptism for Billy on Sunday.
And he'll continue telling the Church of England hierarchy that it should look to its own failures in Britain's cities. James Mates, News at 10, Newcastle.
A public school boy who drew up a hit list of 8 intended victims has been ordered to be detained for 5.5 years for attempting to murder his housemaster. Bristol Crown Court heard that Andre Crumpton, who's now 16, shot Roderick Findlay in front of his class at Colston School in Bristol with a shotgun stolen from his father's collection.
Andre Crumpton, with murder on his mind and enough paracetamol in his pocket to kill himself, set off for school armed with 2 shotguns and live ammunition stolen from his father's gun cabinet. In a school basement, he drank beer and smoked a cigar as he loaded the guns and told schoolmates, "I'm going to kill a teacher." He fired a shot at the deputy head and then confronted Roderick Findlay during a history lesson and shot him in the arm. He had the gun pointed at his head, but was distracted as he fired. Findlay lost 8 pints of blood. Schoolboys using their shirts as tourniquets, the court was told, probably saved his life. The boy had trouble reloading the shotguns and ran off across playing fields. When police arrested Crumpton in a nearby wood, they found a suicide note in his pocket and a book called Kill Point in his holdall. The prosecution said he'd planned a massacre with the names of 8 intended victims written down and the word kill alongside their names. Mr. Justice Swinton Thomas told Crumpton he was guilty of appalling crimes. The boy's father had no comment to make as he left the court. His gun cabinet had been properly locked. The guns and the remaining ammunition were displayed later by police. Tonight, Mr. Findlay, still recovering at home, issued a statement saying violent videos may have led Crumpton to believe he could shoot his way out of his problems. He said he hoped to visit him in prison to ask him why he'd done it. Vernon Man News at 10, Bristol.
The United Nations Secretary-General, Mr. Perez de Cuellar, says he's still confident that all the hostages in the Middle East will be released eventually, but he's warned that the negotiations will be slow and difficult. The Revolutionary Justice Organization in Lebanon said yesterday that it wouldn't release any more hostages until Israel freed 20 more Lebanese prisoners. In Beirut today, Mrs. Sunnyman announced that she was going to Cyprus to live because her husband Jackie's release was no longer imminent.
The disappointment this time is something I hoped I'd never have to go through. We were so near, and now suddenly it's all gone again, and I'm just back to where I was 2.5 years ago.
The industrial group BTR made a £1,500 million takeover bid for Hawker Siddeley. Hawker, now in electrical engineering, said it wasn't enough. Shareholders should reject it. It's the third big takeover bid this week, after Hanson's offer for Beazer and Williams Holdings for Rakel Electronics. The city expects more.
Hawker Siddeley is a grand old name of British engineering, but the group, which produces a range of motors, engines and electrical gear, tonight stands exposed as a sleeping giant. The company dates back to the Biggles era. Its forerunner built the Sopwith camels and pups for the dogfights of the First World War, and later Hurricanes for the Battle of Britain. Now the aerospace interests are almost all gone. The diversified engineer is itself under fire.
Hawker Siddeley is a company who have had a fairly dull record for the whole of the 80s. They've been laid low by the recession, and they're clearly at a very vulnerable point.
So the industrial conglomerate BTR has pounced. It's a renowned takeover expert. Dunlop was snapped up in 1985. BTR's move follows two other major bids this week. Lord Hanson, the takeover king, was involved in one. He, like BTR, wants to buy companies on the cheap, anticipating economic recovery. The record year for stock market takeovers was 1989, £27.9 billion worth. In 1990, as recession took hold, the figure was just £10.6 billion. From January to August this year, only £2.8 billion. This week's three bids are worth almost as much, £2.5 billion.
I suspect these takeover bids reflect the view of those three companies that economic activity is improving, and that now is the time to go for those particular targets before other people compete for them.
Even a giant like Hawker Siddeley is not immune from this new outbreak of takeover fever. Many analysts believe it won't survive this city dogfight as an independent company.
The telecommunications company GPT announced 1,100 redundancies, blaming a fall in orders for its System X public telephone exchanges. 600 of the jobs going are at its Edge Lane factory in Liverpool.
The British Boxing Board of Control say Frank Bruno can fight again, but he must have his eyes checked before every fight. What he's risking to go through this again? A report in part 2. Plus, from Scotland with love, Connery backs the SNP's call for devolution. And training for a trip round the Horn the hard way. That's in a couple of minutes.
This Sunday in You magazine with the Mail on Sunday, find out all about Princess Diana's children, about Prince Harry and Prince William, and about Mariette and Todo, Jurima and Federico. See just what being a mother means to Princess Diana in our special 16-page colour souvenir, only in You magazine this Sunday.
Yo, Nigel, baby, that package has got to be here in the next couple of days or... What? It's arriving 10:30 in the morning. All the way from England. You ought to be on the Benny Hill show, Nigel. If you could do that, honey baby old bean, I'll marry my secretary.
There's now one courier who'll deliver across America by 10:30 a.m. the next day, or your money back.
Oh, honey.
Federal Express, when it absolutely positively has to be there overnight.
may be looking for a car that's small and practical. But you still want a car that feels luxurious. Well, now you've found it, because while the Clio is certainly small, it's perfectly formed.
Nicole?
Papa?
The new Renault Clio.
I say, old chap, give us a hand, will you? Sad, isn't it? Old Waxy here is one of your thermal faxes. Me, I'm the latest thing. A Canon plain paper fax. Upright, eligible, legible, and easy to file. Poor old thing. He's enough to make your toes curl. On paper. If anyone can, Canon can.
The French TGV train. The Japanese bullet. All over the world, new, faster trains are being unveiled. But the fact is, here in Britain, with the launch of the new Intercity 225, we now have more trains going over 100 miles per hour than any other country in Europe. Just thought you ought to know.
The former European heavyweight boxing champion Frank Bruno has been told he can go back in the ring. He's had his licence returned by the British Boxing Board of Control 4 months after an operation to repair a torn retina which had threatened to end his career. But Bruno will have to have his eyes checked again before every bout. He hasn't fought since February 1989 when he lost against the then world champion Mike Tyson.
It took 3.5 hours, but Frank Bruno had won his latest fight.
Nice one.
Where's your car? Sorry. It was a technical knockout. After listening to medical evidence from 4 eye doctors, the boxing board granted Bruno a new licence. He's back in the fight business, ready to answer the call.
He is the challenger, Frank Bruno.
Las Vegas, 1989, Bruno versus Tyson. He put up a spirited performance, but took a pasting which left his eye badly damaged, his career on hold. After losing to Tyson, Bruno became even more popular. He developed a lucrative business interest as a personality and commentator, even appearing in pantomimes. He's already a wealthy man. For personal appearances such as opening supermarkets, he earns about £5,000 a time. TV commercials and advertisements earn him another £200,000, and his pantomime roles at another £50,000 a year. During his 3-year layoff, he's continued to train, continued to dream of getting back into the fight game. Tonight, the boxing board granted his wish. There were strings attached.
There is a condition placed on the license, and that is that before every contest, Frank Bruno must be examined by an ophthalmic consultant nominated by the board.
At a press conference in London tonight, Frank couldn't conceal his jubilation.
I don't really need the money, but I've got boxing in my blood, so I want to get it out of my blood, you know?
And how far do you intend to go with your new boxing career?
We'll see.
And no, it won't interfere with his showbiz interests.
I'm not in show business, you know? I'm just a ducker and diver, swimming above water, doing a little bit of this and a little bit of that, you know?
Like many retired sporting greats, Frank Bruno had always dreamt of a comeback. Now he's getting his chance. So Frank Bruno is on the town and celebrating the relaunch of his boxing career tonight. Despite the warnings of many in the boxing fraternity who think it could prove to be a fight too far, he's all set for a comeback that could net him, according to some estimates, up to £5 million. Ken Rees, News at 10, Central London.
The Spurs and England soccer player Terry Fenwick has started a 4-month jail sentence for failing to give a breath test and driving whilst disqualified. He was also banned from driving for 4 years and fined £300 for driving without insurance. Fenwick, already under a 3-year ban for drink driving, was said in court to be so ashamed and worried about the offence that he was showing signs of illness. He'd been stopped by police outside his own pub in East London. The club said there was no question of his soccer career, however, being finished.
Obviously, we're very disappointed, but then again, we knew the seriousness of it, and so did Terry Fenwick, and he'll take his punishment like the man that he is.
The Scottish National Party is to set up its own government in waiting, ready for when Scotland wins independence from the rest of the United Kingdom. Its chairman, Mr Alex Salmond, told the SNP's annual conference in Inverness that the Scottish case for independence was part of the tide of democracy and self-determination sweeping Europe.
The leader of the SNP brought a clear message to the conference in Inverness today. The new tide of democracy flowing through Europe means they must now abandon the mantle of a party of protest and prepare to become a party of government.
Europe is changing. We are changing. Scotland will change too. The despair of the last decade is being replaced by a new mood of hope and expectation. The 1980s may have belonged to Thatcher and the Tories, but the 1990s will belong to Scotland. Thank you.
Despite the euphoria, the party is still running a distant third in the polls. That's where 007 comes in, the latest recruit to their cause. It's hoped Sean Connery's performance at the box office will mobilise similar miracles at the ballot box.
Take oil, for example. Now, Scotland's got loads of this stuff. We've had loads of this stuff for years. But the money goes down south.
But the SNP's small band of MPs at Westminster will face a tough task in swelling their numbers. They're targeting the disenchanted Labour vote.
We are saying to people in Scotland, look south of the border and look at Tory England going back to put in an English Tory government. A Labour vote in Scotland's a wasted vote.
For the new look SNP, the campaign for a general election is already well underway. David Chater, News at 10 in Inverness.
Cricket. Derbyshire won today to finish third in the county championship behind Essex and Warwickshire. Derbyshire beat Yorkshire by 40 runs. Glamorgan beat Hampshire by 7 wickets. Leicestershire beat Kent by 90 runs. Lancashire beat Surrey by 1 wicket. Sussex beat Gloucestershire by 139 runs. And Warwickshire beat Somerset, all out for 403, by 5 runs. Somerset finished bottom of the championship table. Tonight soccer in the Barclays League Division 4. Aldershot 1, Halifax 3. Doncaster 0, Blackpool 2, and Blackpool go top.
And tonight's main points again. The commander of Yugoslavia's federal forces has told ITN he'll order troops into any cities to rescue his men besieged by Croatian forces. The Yugoslav president says federal army generals are out of control, and he's appealed to ordinary soldiers to desert and not to fight. Tonight, a huge armoured column is mounting a 3-pronged attack on towns along Croatia's eastern border. And here, the Prime Minister has counterattacked the Archbishop of Canterbury's claim that social deprivation led to inner-city riots. Mr Major said not all the rioters came from deprived backgrounds.
Finally, the daughter of the celebrated sea adventurer John Ridgway is hoping to get her own name in the record books this winter as the first woman to round Cape Horn in a canoe. Rebecca Ridgway, who's 24, will be part of an expedition led by her father and trained at his adventure school in Sutherland. They plan to start on the north shore of the Beagle Channel, then paddle through the storms and islands of Tierra del Fuego, down to and round the Cape.
Frail sea kayaks against the 50-foot swell of the world's stormiest seas. Conditions on Loch Laxford near Cape Wrath, where John Ridgway founded his adventure school, are peaceful by comparison with the roaring 40s. Rebecca Ridgway is bidding to become the first woman to make the perilous journey. Of course, adventure runs in the Ridgway blood. 25 years ago, her father, with Che Blythe, rowed across the Atlantic. 2 years later, he bid farewell to the infant Rebecca as he started out to sail single-handed around the world. This time, they're going together. Rebecca has joined that exclusive, self-selected club of passionate British adventurers.
I always really wanted to do something which was a big test. You just have to keep going and sort of keep concentrating, really, because once you go into the water, that's when the trouble really starts. It's so cold. If you capsize, then your head gets very cold and you just lose balance, really, and then you're going to go in again and again, and that's very dangerous.
And just that happened in training. Top canoeist Nigel Dennis tried to perform a manoeuvre called an Eskimo roll, to rotate the kayak through a full circle. But the weight of our camera on its bows prevented Dennis from righting his craft. With the kayaks loaded for the expedition, the same thing could happen in 40-foot seas. A routine exercise had become a full-scale rehearsal for a sea rescue. But for John Ridgway, in his eyrie overlooking Ardmore, the excitement still outweighs the danger, even after a quarter of a century.
I love the excitement. I just love the excitement of being involved in this. And I'm thrilled that the others like it too.
And do you think Rebecca gets the same sort of buzz, the same sort of feeling from that?
I know she does.
Marie-Christine Ridgway will be able to keep in contact with her husband and daughter through a new satellite telex and tracking system being developed by British Telecom. At least she'll know moment by moment how they fare in their struggle against the huge winds and waves of the Cape at the end of the Earth.
That's news at 10 from Julia and from me. A very good night to you and have a good weekend.
Back next weekend on Walden, the people who matter on the issues which count.
They may fail, Brian. They may fail. I may end up with egg all over my face because they fail.
My answer is, you can't have it out of both pockets. That's the truth.
I'll be back with a new series from next weekend on Sundays at 1:10 on ITV. See you then.
Bruised but in the clear, these men demand an inquiry into police violence. A London landmark is wrecked by a falling crane. And more cuts ahead for rail commuters. Good evening. The policing of Hackney is being questioned again tonight. It follows a court case today when police evidence about a punch-up was thrown out by a jury and 2 men walked free. Carson Black reports.
Michael Lavery and Jeffrey Eaton are celebrating tonight at the end of a 9-month ordeal. On New Year's Day, they were arrested for being drunk and disorderly in Hoxton. A skirmish developed involving several police officers from City Road Police Station, Hackney. The men were left with 40 cuts and bruises between them, but both were charged with assaulting the police. Today, a jury at Inner London Crown Court threw out the charges after hearing that it was in fact the police who had launched an unprovoked attack on the men. In his summing up earlier today, Recorder Walter Ayland said it had been a vile and vicious attack by the police on the 2 men, and it had manifestly been a case in which lies had been told. In all, 8 officers gave evidence, but the jury heard that police had fabricated their notes. For the defendants, there's relief at the verdict, but disgust at the police.
This case has been going on long enough, 9 months, nearly 10 months. It's been dragging on. The police have made total fabrications. They've made me liars, which they are, and I feel disgusted with it.
The 2 are now suing the police for false imprisonment, malicious prosecution and assault. Last year, 7 officers from the same police station were sacked after a similar acquittal on driver Gary Stretch. He was beaten over the head with a bottle and almost lost an ear. Tonight, community leaders in Hackney were calling for a public inquiry into policing in the borough. The Metropolitan Police said it would investigate any complaints made against its officers. Carson Black, LWT News, Hackney.
There's a new lead tonight in the Lynn Rogers murder hunt. Police have put a new face to the killer of the London teenager. This is the new suspect. A shopper overheard him making 4 calls to Lynn's home from a phone box in Crawley. Detectives are convinced they're now very close to catching her strangler. Police believe that Lynn from Catford went to meet the man after he offered her a new job. And there's more on Crime Monthly after this bulletin. Other news now, an historic London church is in ruins tonight after a crane crashed down through its roof. The crane caused more damage than a German bomb that hit the church during the Second World War. From the city, David Harvey reports.
The genius of Christopher Wren smashed in seconds.
The St James Garlick Hythe Church had been lovingly restored over 6 years, but now the 1682 church pews are matchwood under tons of twisted metal and concrete. The construction crane ploughed into the side of the church and ripped through the floor, destroying the burial chamber below.
Absolutely devastated. Absolutely devastated. I couldn't believe my eyes. It's worse than any damage that was done during the war.
The 100-foot crane toppled from a building site opposite the church on Upper Thames Street during the morning rush hour. Unbelievably, only one person was hurt in this accident, and that was the crane driver himself. As the crane was coming down, he jumped from his cabin just before it hit the ground. He was then taken to hospital with a leg injury. With 100 fixed cranes operating across the capital, tonight investigators were working hard to find out why this one fell out of the sky. It's expected that the clean-up operation will take most of the weekend. David Harvey, LWT News in the city.
There was more bad news today for Network South East commuters. Multi-million-pound cuts in investment on the Kent and Tilbury lines will mean fewer new trains introduced and delays to station modernisation. Malcolm Munro reports.
Extremely poor service was how British Rail described itself today in a notice at Waterloo. Another apology on a day when Network South East slashed £30 million off its budget, making more than £100 million worth of cuts this year. More than 600 new coaches planned for 3 lines to Kent and Tilbury will be hit. Other projects will be shelved too, dismaying rail users.
The trains that are running now, youngsters are travelling to work in them and to school. Their grandparents were travelling on them in the 50s and early 60s.
Dear oh dear, but a very familiar story, isn't it, in our present climate?
For me, in particular, the Waterloo and City line is a bone of contention, and that needs to be invested in very quickly.
The network blame falling ticket sales and want more help from the government.
The Department of Transport have not yet decided how much cash to inject into Network South East next year. Officials here say that will be negotiated over the next few months. Network South East say that £500 million a year is needed for proper investments. It's considered unlikely the government will find that kind of money, which means commuters like those travelling home tonight will miss out on better and more reliable trains. Malcolm Munro, LWT News, Waterloo Station.
It was decision day for 2 London sportsmen, and with very different verdicts. Terry Fenwick, the Spurs and former England star, was sent to prison for 4 months. He admitted failing to give a breath test and driving while banned. Fenwick was arrested outside the Camel Pub in Bethnal Green. He'd been celebrating Tottenham's European win over Stockerau in August. But there's good news for Frank Bruno tonight. He's been given permission to box again. His licence had been suspended when he suffered damage to his right eye during his last fight 2.5 years ago with Mike Tyson. Bruno emerged from a 4-hour hearing by the Boxing Board of Control to say he can't wait to get back in that ring. And finally, from the LWT news desk, they've been doing some strange things in London today. Near Blackfriars Bridge, demonstrators spread their message about Tibet during an abseil. The giant-sized idea was to raise sponsorship for projects for Tibetan people. And on Clapham Common, the bizarre sight of a flute player in a giant bubble. It was a rehearsal for a festival called Music of the Spheres. The launch, quite literally, is tomorrow night. Let's hope his particular bubble doesn't burst. Well, that's all from our news for tonight. We're back at 1:05 tomorrow. Do join us then.
Live and exclusive, Saturday at 9:50 on ITV, The Rematch. Chris Eubank clashes again with Michael Watson. This time, it's the super middleweight crown that's at stake. When they met in June, Eubank won after a controversial points decision, so this really is a grudge match. Eubank v Watson, Saturday 9:50, live and exclusive on ITV.
Good evening. The fine weather looks set to continue tomorrow, but it'll become more unsettled by Sunday. Tonight will be dry with mostly clear skies and just a few fog or mist patches. Temperatures falling as low as 5 Celsius in rural parts. Tomorrow will dawn sunny, heating up steadily after a cool morning. The afternoon will start dry with cloud increasing to the east, bringing some showers later on. Quite warm, temperatures up to about 23 Celsius, 73 Fahrenheit, and a light to moderate southerly breeze. Sunday will start cloudy with showers, although brighter weather will spread to all parts during the afternoon. Fresher than tomorrow with a brisk west wind and top temperatures around 19 Celsius, 66 Fahrenheit. So if you're planning to take the family to the Japan Festival in Hyde Park this weekend, you'd better make it tomorrow. I'll leave you with a summary. Have a good night.
In a few minutes, Paul Ross with Crime Monthly.
When I was a lad, there were only one brown bread for me, and that were always. I were weaned on it, schooled on it. I went to work on it.